Hey guys, if you are new here, then please consider subscribing. I upload true horror stories like this, and if you are a fan, then you would definitely enjoy my other content. I have collected true chilling stalker stories to share with you today. If any of these shock you, then let me know in the comments. I would love to hear your thoughts. So before we get started, make yourself comfortable. Turn down the lights and let's begin. It all started innocently enough, just another day in my routine life. I was in my early 20s, living in a small apartment and working a mundane office job that barely paid the bills. I used to spend evenings scrolling through social media, catching up with friends, or just binge watching random shows. That was my world, and I loved the simplicity of it. But you know how they say that a storm can brew in clear skies? Well, that's how it started for me. One night, I was scrolling through Instagram, and I noticed a new follower. His profile was private, but something about it caught my attention. I didn't think much of it at first. I mean, who doesn't want more followers? But then, over the next few days, I started to notice the same username popping up in my likes. It was strange, but not alarming. I brushed it off, assuming he was just another random guy who liked my pictures. As the days went by, however, things shifted from strange to unsettling. I began receiving comments on my posts that felt oddly personal. He would reference things I hadn't shared online, things I thought only my close friends knew. It started as benign observations but escalated quickly. Comments about my favorite coffee shop, my love for hiking, even a few mentions of my dog. I felt a chill run down my spine. It was one thing for someone to like your photos. It was another for them to know so much about your life without ever having met you. At first, I tried to ignore it. I thought maybe he was just a really good observer or someone who had mutual friends. But then I noticed he started showing up in places I frequented. It was subtle at first, a glimpse of him at the coffee shop I loved or a fleeting shadow in the park where I took my dog every morning. Each sighting was harmless in isolation, but they began to gnaw at me. I couldn't shake this growing sense of being watched. Things escalated when he started messaging me. They were vague enough to not be overtly threatening, but still made my skin crawl. He would comment on my stories, expressing surprise over my daily activities, as if he were tracking my every move. I considered blocking him, but something kept me from doing it. Part of me wanted to confront the situation, to understand who this person was and what he wanted. One evening, I was out for a run in my neighborhood, the sun setting, casting a beautiful golden hue over everything. I took my usual route, but on that particular evening, I noticed a figure in the distance. He was standing by a tree, just watching. My heart raced as I ran past him, adrenaline kicking in. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew that it was him, the stalker. I ran home, locking the door behind me, a wave of panic flooding my chest. I felt like I was in a horror movie, and I was the unsuspecting protagonist. I spent the night researching stalking laws, looking for resources on how to deal with the situation. I wanted to feel empowered, but the more I read, the more helpless I felt. I considered going to the police, but didn't want to appear paranoid. What could they do about someone who hadn't physically harmed me? Days turned into weeks, and the stalking continued. He'd leave comments that felt like taunts, like he was daring me to react. The more I tried to ignore him, the more he seemed to ramp it up. He began showing up in my life in ways that felt too coincidental to be random. I'd see him at grocery stores, at the gym, places I frequented. I started to change my routines, but somehow he would still find me. It was like he was a step ahead, predicting my every move. I started to feel paranoid, looking over my shoulder everywhere I went. Friends began to notice my anxiety, and I reluctantly shared what was happening. They were supportive, urging me to go to the police, but I still hesitated. I didn't want to sound crazy. The thing is, I knew this wasn't a bad breakup or a jilted ex. This was a stranger who had made it his mission to invade my life, and I felt trapped in my own skin. Then came the night that changed everything. I was home alone, binge-watching show, trying to forget the creeping dread that had settled over me. Suddenly, I heard a noise outside. It was faint at first, just the sound of something brushing against the window. I froze, heart pounding. My mind raced with possibilities. I grabbed my phone and turned off the lights, peeking through the blinds. There he was, standing in my front yard, illuminated by the dim glow of the street lamp. I couldn't believe it. He was actually there, staring at my window. I felt a surge of panic wash over me. I called the police, my voice shaky as I tried to explain the situation. They assured me that they were sending someone over, but it felt like an eternity before they arrived. By the time they got there, he was gone. I could only point to the spot where he had been standing, shaking as I recounted the events. The officers listened, taking notes, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. I felt like a fool, like I was wasting their time. They left with a promise to keep an eye on the area, but I knew that wouldn't change anything. The police report didn't help me sleep that night. I felt more vulnerable than ever, wondering if I'd ever get my life back. My once cozy apartment felt like a prison. I started double-checking locks, avoiding going out at night, and even considered moving. It was exhausting. I found myself living in a constant state of fear, my world shrinking down to the walls of my apartment. Weeks turned into a blur of anxiety and isolation. I stopped posting on social media, fearing that I was only feeding his obsession. Yet, even in silence, the unease lingered. I felt trapped in a nightmare with no way out. The final straw came when I received a package at my doorstep. It was unmarked, but I felt a wave of dread wash over me as I opened it. Inside was a photo of me taken from a distance, clearly without my knowledge, doing something mundane. It felt like a punch to the gut. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag, leaving everything behind, and drove to my parent house in another city. I needed to escape to find some semblance of safety, even if it meant starting over. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, fearing that he could somehow trace me. Driving away, I felt a mix of relief and fear. The thought that he might still be out there, lurking in the shadows, made my heart race. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a glimmer of hope. I knew I had to reclaim my life, but the shadow of that stalking would always linger in the back of my mind, a reminder of how fragile my sense of safety truly was. I always imagined stalking happened to other people, the ones who had something interesting about them, like a glamorous job or a quirky lifestyle that attracted attention. Me? I was just a regular college student, going through my classes, hanging out with friends, and living my life in a small town. But then everything changed one evening when I noticed someone lingering outside my apartment building. It started off innocently enough, just a figure in a hoodie standing across the street, but as the days turned into weeks, this person became a constant presence in my life. At first, I tried to brush it off as paranoia. I convinced myself that it was just someone waiting for a bus or perhaps a lost soul trying to find their way. But every time I walked out, they were there. I catch glimpses of them from the corner of my eye, their hood pulled low, obscuring their face. It was unsettling, like being watched by a ghost. I remember the first time I actually got a good look at them. I was coming home late from the library, exhausted and ready to collapse into bed. I glanced up as I approached the front door, and for a split second, our eyes met. There was something about the way they looked at me that sent a chill down my spine, a mix of curiosity and something darker. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me, my heart pounding. I tried to talk myself down. It's just a coincidence, I thought. But the next day, they were there again, and my stomach dropped. It was like I was stuck in a bad horror movie, where the protagonist ignores all the warning signs. I started to notice them more often, like they were following me, always lurking in the background of my daily routine. I'd see them at the coffee shop, their eyes darting to me as I waited for my drink. I'd spot them walking behind me on campus, staying at a distance but never far enough away to feel safe. My friends joked about it, saying I had an admirer, but I could see the concern in their eyes when I told them. They urged me to report it, but I didn't want to seem dramatic or paranoid. Things escalated quickly. One evening, after a particularly long day, I returned home to find my apartment door slightly ajar. My heart raced as I pushed it open, half expecting to find someone inside. But it was empty, and nothing appeared to be missing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, that they had been waiting for me to come home. I checked every corner of the apartment, every closet, and under the bed, but there was no sign of anyone. I locked the door tightly and called my friend, who insisted on coming over to stay with me. As the days passed, the feeling of being hunted only grew stronger. I started to receive strange messages online, innocuous at first, but they became more unsettling as time went on. Someone would comment on my social media posts, referencing things I hadn't shared publicly. They knew my schedule, my favorite places to go, even the coffee shop I frequented. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. I started to avoid going out alone and change my route to class, but it didn't help. They were always there, a shadow lurking in my life, their presence inescapable. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I set up cameras around my apartment, hoping to catch a glimpse of this person. I documented everything, the figure outside, the messages, the creeping dread that followed me every waking moment. I contacted the police, but they brushed me off, telling me there wasn't much they could do unless I had concrete evidence. So I kept recording, convinced that if I could just gather enough proof, they would take me seriously. But every time I reviewed the footage, I felt more and more isolated. The person never got close enough to be identified, always lurking at the periphery, just out of reach. Weeks turned into months, and the dread morphed into a constant state of anxiety. My friends began to notice my decline. I would jump at every little noise, my hands shaking as I tried to explain what I was experiencing. They urged me to go out to live my life, but I felt trapped in my own home, a prisoner to my fear. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, every shadow morphing into something more sinister. I stopped going out at night, opting for the safety of my cramped apartment. One day, I decided I had had enough. I was going to confront this person, to demand they leave me alone. I waited until the sun set and gathered all my courage. I stepped outside, scanning the area for the familiar figure. My heart raced as I spotted them standing near the edge of the street, just as they had done countless times before. But this time, I wasn't going to let fear control me. I marched towards them, adrenaline coursing through my veins, ready to confront my tormentor. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. The figure didn't move. They stood still, almost frozen as I approached. My confidence began to waver, and I hesitated. But there was no turning back now. I called out, demanding they leave me alone, that I didn't want anything to do with them. It felt good to finally confront the source of my fear, to take back some semblance of control. But as I got close enough to see their face, my heart dropped. It was someone I recognized, a classmate I had seen around campus but never really interacted with. The look in their eyes was not one of anger or fear, but something far more unsettling, fixation. They didn't speak. Instead, they just stared at me, a sickly smile creeping across their lips. It was then I realized that this wasn't just a random person. This was someone who had been studying me, learning my habits, waiting for this moment. I turned on my heel and ran back to my apartment, slamming the door behind me, my mind racing. I had confronted my stalker, but the revelation only deepened my fear. I wasn't just dealing with a stranger. I was entangled with someone who had been watching me from the shadows, and they were closer than I had ever thought. From that moment on, I knew I couldn't just hide. I had to take the threat seriously. I reached out for help, finally finding the courage to speak to the police again, armed with video evidence and the chilling revelation of who it was. They took me seriously this time, and with their help, I began the long process of reclaiming my life. But the lingering fear remained, a constant reminder of how close I had come to something far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. I learned that sometimes the monsters we fear are not just figments of our imagination. They can be people we see every day, hiding in plain sight. It all started on a Wednesday, the kind of day that feels like a filler in a week. I was heading home from work, tired and ready to collapse on my bed with a slice of cold pizza and a binge-worthy show. The streets were familiar, the same cracked sidewalks and tired street lamps lit my path, but that day felt different. I noticed a guy standing outside the corner store, just lingering. I brushed it off as nothing, but the way he was staring made my skin crawl. I could feel my heart race a little faster, but I told myself it was just paranoia. After all, I had a long day and was probably imagining things. The next day, I saw him again. This time he was on the same corner but leaning against the wall, arms crossed, watching everyone who passed by like a hawk. I felt that familiar jolt of unease but tried to convince myself that he was just another bored guy hanging out. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Maybe he was waiting for someone, I thought. I decided to take a different route home, just to avoid him. Things progressed slowly but steadily. A few days later, I noticed him at the bus stop across from my apartment. He sat there, eyes glued to his phone, but I could feel his gaze drift towards me when I walked by. It was a small moment, but it sent chills down my spine. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I was being dramatic. But every time I saw him, my mind would race, filling in the gaps with worst-case scenarios. By the end of the week, I was seeing him everywhere. At the grocery store, in the park, even at the coffee shop I frequented. It was like he had become a part of my daily routine, just lurking in the background. I could almost convince myself that it was coincidence until I noticed he had started to change his patterns. He was always in my vicinity, but he never seemed to interact with anyone else. It was like I had become his sole focus. I decided to take action, thinking I could shake him off by changing my routine. I started leaving for work earlier, taking different routes, and even skipping my usual coffee shop. But no matter what I did, he was there. It was infuriating and terrifying at the same time. It felt like I was being hunted, like I was the prey in a twisted game, and he was the predator. One night, I decided to go out with friends, trying to reclaim some semblance of normalcy. We hit up a local bar, and just as I was starting to relax, I caught a glimpse of him through the window. He was standing across the street, hands in his pockets, scanning the crowd. My heart sank. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. I spent the rest of the night looking over my shoulder, convinced he was watching me. Things took a darker turn when I started receiving strange messages on social media. At first, they seemed harmless, even funny. A meme here, a random comment on a post there. Then they turned sinister. "I see you," one read, followed by a picture of me walking home from work. It was taken from a distance, but I recognized the street. I felt my stomach drop as I realized how close he was. I blocked the account and reported it, but it didn't help. I still felt his presence lurking around every corner. I decided to confide in a couple of friends. They were supportive but didn't seem to grasp the severity of the situation. "You're overthinking it," they said, brushing it off as me being overly paranoid. I wanted to scream at them, to make them understand that this wasn't just my imagination. But I forced a smile and nodded, pretending everything was fine. I even considered moving, but that felt extreme. I didn't want to let him win. As the weeks dragged on, my anxiety peaked. I started having nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat, heart pounding. I felt like a prisoner in my own life. I rarely left my apartment unless I absolutely had to, and even then, I was hyper-aware of every noise, every shadow. My friends tried to drag me out, but I always found an excuse to stay in. I spent my evenings researching stalker behavior, trying to find some sort of comfort in knowing that I wasn't alone. Then, one night, everything changed. I was sitting in my living room, lights dimmed, trying to focus on a movie. My phone buzzed with a notification, and for a split second, I felt a flicker of hope that it was a message from a friend. But when I picked it up, my heart sank. It was another message from that same account. This time, it was a video. I clicked on it hesitantly, and my blood ran cold as I watched. It was footage of me in my apartment, captured through my window. I could see myself, a silhouette against the glow of the TV, completely unaware that I was being watched. I dropped my phone, panic surging through me. I was frozen for a moment, just staring at the screen, trying to process what I had seen. I finally snapped back to reality and grabbed my keys, bolting out the door. I didn't even think about where I was going. I just needed to get away. I ran down the street, my heart racing, fear gripping my chest. I didn't know what I was running from, but I felt it. I spent the night at a friend's place, shaking and trying to catch my breath. I told them everything, and this time they took me seriously. They helped me file a report with the police, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. The officer took my statement, but I could tell he was just humoring me. "We'll keep an eye out," he said, but I knew that meant nothing. Days turned into weeks, and I still felt that suffocating fear. I kept expecting to see him on my street, lurking in the shadows, but he never showed up again. It was like he had vanished. I tried to convince myself that maybe he got bored or found a different target, but deep down, I knew it wasn't over. I could still feel his presence, like a ghost, haunting my thoughts. Even now, as I write this, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, convinced that I'll see him standing there, watching me again. I wish I could say I've moved on, that I've reclaimed my life. But the truth is, I still feel trapped, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I've learned to live with the fear, but every time I hear a noise outside, every time I see a shadow move, I'm reminded that some things don't just go away. They linger, waiting for the right moment to strike. There's a chill that wraps around you when you realize you're being watched, a sensation that claws at the back of your mind and doesn't let go. I remember the first time it happened to me. I was just a regular college student, trying to balance classes, work, and a social life. My daily routine was predictable, almost mundane. I'd walk to campus, grab a coffee, sit in lectures, and then head to my part-time job at a cafe. Nothing special, nothing that would alert me to the fact that someone was lurking in the shadows, cataloging my every move. It started innocently enough, or at least it seemed that way. I noticed a guy hanging around a cafe where I worked. He would come in several times a week, always ordering the same black coffee and sitting at the corner table. I thought he was just a regular customer, but soon enough, I noticed how he would watch me when I was busy cleaning tables or chatting with my coworkers. It was unsettling, but I brushed it off as my imagination running wild. Maybe I was just paranoid. But then things escalated. I catch glimpses of him outside the cafe, standing under the awning, staring at the door like he was waiting for something or someone. I remember one evening, I left work late, the streets eerily quiet. As I walked to my car, I felt that prickling sensation again, the sense that someone was behind me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him, a shadow lurking in the dim light. My heart raced, and I hurried into my car, locking the doors as I drove away. The next day, I decided to take a different route to campus, hoping to shake off the feeling of being followed. But there he was again, sitting on a bench, his gaze fixed on me as I walked by. As days turned into weeks, this pattern continued. I changed my schedule, altered my routine, even started taking the bus instead of driving, but he always seemed to know where I was going. It was like he had an internal GPS tracking my movements. I felt trapped, like a mouse in a maze, and he was the cat waiting to pounce. I confided in my friends about the situation, but they dismissed it as me being overly dramatic. They were supportive, of course, but the fear I felt was intangible, something they couldn't grasp. I started to avoid places I usually loved. My favorite coffee shop, the library, even my own neighborhood. I felt like I was living in a never-ending game of hide and seek, and I was always the one hiding. Then came the night that changed everything. I was finishing a late shift at the cafe, and the streets were empty. I had my earbuds in, trying to block out the world around me, when I felt a presence creeping up behind me. I glanced back, and there he was, closer than ever. Panic surged through me as I quickened my pace, but he mirrored my movements, a predator toying with its prey. I ducked into an alley, hoping to lose him, but my heart sank when I saw him turn the corner, still following me. I sprinted down the narrow path, my breath coming in sharp gasps, adrenaline flooding my veins. My mind raced as I searched for an escape. I spotted a group of people in the distance and made a beeline for them, praying he wouldn't follow. Just as I reached them, I glanced back, and to my horror, he had stopped, standing still at the mouth of the alley, watching me with an unsettling calmness. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized he had been playing with me the whole time. After that night, I decided I couldn't just live in fear anymore. I reported him to campus security, but they could do little more than take my statement. They told me to be cautious, to stay in well-lit areas, and avoid being alone. It felt like a temporary band-aid on a festering wound. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, always scanning the streets for that familiar figure. I started carrying pepper spray and even took a self-defense class, though it did little to quell the gnawing anxiety that had taken root in my mind. One evening, I returned home after a long day, feeling particularly drained. I stepped into my apartment, locked the door, and leaned against it, sighing in relief. But a knot formed in my stomach when I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing across the street, half hidden in the shadows. It was him. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and called a friend, my hands trembling as I watched him linger there, unmoving. I was trapped in my own sanctuary, a prisoner in my home. I told my friend about the latest incident, and she insisted I stay with her for a few days. I agreed, desperate for some semblance of safety. But even at her place, I felt the weight of his gaze. I became paranoid, peeking out the windows every few minutes, convinced he was watching me. The days turned into a blur of anxiety, and I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Was he really out there, or had my fear twisted my perception? Then one night, I decided to confront my fears. I returned to my apartment, determined to reclaim my space. I locked the door and pulled the curtains tight. I turned on all the lights, hoping to dispel the shadows that had invaded my life. I felt empowered, like I was taking back control. But as I sat on the couch, the sense of security began to fade. I heard a faint sound, a soft tapping. My heart dropped as I realized it was coming from the window. I approached cautiously, peering out into the darkness. My breath hitched in my throat when I saw him standing there, staring directly at me, his expression unreadable. I backed away, panic flooding my senses. I grabbed my phone again and dialed the police, my hands shaking as I explained the situation. They assured me they'd send someone over, but the wait felt like an eternity. I remained glued to my spot, my eyes never leaving that window, hyper-aware of every creak and groan of the building around me. Finally, sirens wailed in the distance, cutting through the silence. I heard the heavy footsteps of officers approaching my door. I rushed to let them in, relief washing over me. They searched the area, but found nothing. He had vanished, like smoke in the wind. They advised me to stay vigilant, to call them if I saw him again. In the days that followed, I felt like I was living in a horror movie, constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting him to jump out at any moment. I changed my routine once more, avoiding the cafe and taking a different route to class. I even started considering moving home for a while, anything to escape the suffocating fear. Eventually, I settled into a fragile state of acceptance. I learned to live with the anxiety, always aware that I wasn't truly safe. I didn't see him again for months, but the fear never left. I would often catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him lurking in the shadows. I never got closure or a sense of resolution, He simply faded into my past, but the imprint he left on my life remains. Sometimes I wonder if he still watches from afar, a ghost haunting my memories. I've come to realize that some stories don't have neat endings, and sometimes the monsters linger long after the lights go out. I never thought my life would turn into a twisted episode of a crime show, but here we are. It all kicked off a normal Friday evening when I decided to head to a local coffee shop to unwind. I was looking forward to a quiet evening with my favorite book and the comforting aroma of fresh coffee. Little did I know, that would be the last time I felt safe in my own skin. It started subtly. At first, I noticed a guy sitting a few tables away, always glancing in my direction. I thought nothing of it. People often stare when they're bored or curious. But as the days turned into weeks, his presence became more pronounced. He was there almost every time I visited the shop, sipping his coffee and keeping a careful eye on me. I tried to shrug it off, convincing myself that I was overthinking it. After all, people get lost in thought all the time, right? But the situation escalated. One evening, as I was leaving, I felt a chill run down my spine. I glanced back and saw him standing outside, just a few feet away, hands in his pockets, watching me. I quickened my pace, heart racing, and turned down a side street to shake off the uneasy feeling. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, so I continued going to the coffee shop, hoping I was imagining things. Over the next few weeks, I began to notice other odd occurrences. I spotted him around my neighborhood when I went for runs, but I told myself it was just coincidence. I wasn't the only one who lived in the area after all. Still, the unease gnawed at me. I started varying my schedule, choosing different routes, and trying to avoid the coffee shop altogether. But somehow he always seemed to be one step ahead, lurking in the background, like a shadow that refused to fade. The real turning point came one evening when I returned home from work. I parked my car, and as I walked toward my apartment, I noticed something strange. The garbage bins were knocked over, trash strewn across the pavement. I bent down to pick up some of the litter, but then I froze. There, sticking out from underneath a pile of refuse, was a piece of paper. It was a crumpled receipt from the coffee shop, the same one where I had seen him countless times. My stomach dropped. It felt like a message, a taunt, a reminder that he was watching me, even when I wasn't aware. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing noises outside, my mind racing with thoughts of what he might be planning. I was terrified, but also felt a strange sense of anger. Why was he doing this? What did he want? I decided I had to confront the situation head on. The next day, I called a friend, explaining everything. She was supportive, urging me to report this to the police. But I hesitated. I didn't have concrete evidence. It all felt a bit too nebulous. Days turned into weeks, and the stalking became more brazen. I'd see him waiting near my building, or I'd spot him in the grocery store when I was picking up essentials. My heart would race, and I felt trapped in a horror narrative with no escape. I started to look over my shoulder constantly, my sense of safety eroding day by day. I couldn't go anywhere without feeling his eyes on me. I'd see him flicker in and out of my vision, a ghost that haunted my every move. The turning point happened one rainy Friday evening. I was running late and decided to grab dinner from a nearby takeout place. As I stepped outside, umbrella in hand, I nearly collided with him. He was standing right there, inches away, his expression unreadable. Panic surged through me. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my umbrella. He didn't say anything, just stood there, blocking my path. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest, and pushed past him, desperate to get away. I rushed home, locked the door behind me, and tried to calm down. That was it. I couldn't ignore this any longer. I reached out to the police the next day, recounting everything, the receipts, the sightings, the fear that had taken root in my life. They took my report seriously, but I could tell they were skeptical. "We'll keep an eye out," they said, but I felt a pit in my stomach. What if they couldn't help? For the next few days, I felt like I was living in a bubble of paranoia. I stopped going to my favorite coffee shop, avoided the streets I normally walked, and even changed my routine to keep him guessing. It was exhausting, always looking over my shoulder, and I felt like I was slipping into a state of paranoia. Then, one night, it finally boiled over. I had just settled down for the evening with my favorite show when I heard a knock at the door. My heart stopped. It was late, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I crept to the peephole and nearly screamed. It was him. My mind raced with possibilities. How did he find my apartment? What did he want? I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear him breathing, could feel the weight of his presence on the other side of the door. I called the police, my hands shaking as I whispered into the phone. They assured me they were on their way, but every second felt like an eternity. I could hear him moving, pacing outside, and my imagination ran wild with what he might be planning. Finally, there were sirens in the distance and a knock on my door. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived when I realized he was gone. I opened the door to the officers, explained the situation, and they began to search the area. They found nothing, and I felt hollow. I was left with the unsettling knowledge that he had been in my space, that crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The police advised me to take precautions, to change my routine, and consider moving if things escalated. I felt like a prisoner in my own life, unable to escape the clutches of someone who had made it their mission to invade my existence. I changed my locks, installed a security system, and began to take self-defense classes. It was no longer about just being cautious. It was about reclaiming my life. Months passed, and the fear gradually morphed into something else. Anger, resolve. I refused to let him win. I decided to take back my life. I began to go out again, to take control of my routine, to live as normally as I could. I still felt his shadow looming over me, but I was determined to push through. And just when I thought I was finally breaking free from his grip, I saw him again, standing across the street, watching. The familiar chill ran down my spine, but this time, I didn't run. I stood my ground, locked eyes with him, and let the anger boil beneath the surface. I refused to let him define my life. I turned and walked away, knowing this wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of hope. I would not be a victim. I would be the one to take my life back, no matter how long it took. I'm just an average person living in a small town, going to work, hanging out with friends, trying to survive the daily grind like everyone else. But then one day, everything changed, and what started as a minor annoyance spiraled into a nightmare I couldn't escape. It began quietly enough. I noticed a guy at the coffee shop I frequented. He was always sitting at the same table, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face. At first, I didn't think much of it. People have their routines, right? I'd see him every morning, sipping his black coffee while scrolling through his phone. I'd occasionally catch a glimpse of him when I'd go to pick up my order, but he always seemed lost in his own world. I figured he was just another lonely soul looking for comfort in caffeine. But then I started to see him everywhere. At the grocery store, he'd be in the same aisle as me, pretending to look at cereal while I picked out my favorite brand. At the gym, he'd be there too. Always a few machines down, his gaze fixed on me from the corner of his eye. It felt weird, but I brushed it off. Maybe it was just coincidence. I doubted he even noticed me. One night, I was out with friends at a local bar. We were laughing, dancing, and just trying to enjoy the weekend when I felt that familiar chill creep down my spine. I turned around, and there he was standing at the bar, staring right at me. My stomach dropped, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. He didn't approach me, didn't even move, just stood there, drink in hand, observing me like I was some kind of exhibit. I quickly turned back to my friends, trying to act normal, but I could feel his eyes boring into me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped. As the weeks went on, he became more intrusive. I'd find notes slipped under my windshield wiper or little gifts left on my doorstep. Nothing too crazy, just small trinkets that felt more unsettling than sweet. A rock with a strange inscription, a half-burned candle, a single yellow flower with a wilted stem. I tried to ignore it, but each item felt like a breadcrumb leading me further into a dark forest I didn't want to enter. It was like he was trying to build some sort of connection, but the thought of it made my skin crawl. I started to change my routine, hoping to shake him off. I'd take different routes to work, avoid the coffee shop, and even switch gyms. But no matter what I did, he always seemed to be one step ahead. One evening, I decided to go for a jog at the park, thinking it would be a safe choice. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the path, and for a moment, I felt at ease. That was until I spotted him in the distance, leaning against a tree, just watching me. My heart raced, and I quickly turned back, cutting my run short. I couldn't believe how far this had gone. How was he always there? It got worse. I started receiving messages on social media. At first, they were innocuous enough, just vague comments about my posts. But soon they became more personal, referencing things I hadn't shared publicly, like my favorite places to eat or my recent trip to the beach. It was as if he was collecting pieces of my life, using them to craft some twisted narrative that revolved around me. I felt exposed, like I was being stripped of my privacy, and it made me feel sick. I finally decided to report him to the police. I thought maybe this would be the wake-up call he needed, that they would speak to him and he'd back off. But when I described him, they didn't seem shocked or concerned. They treated it like a nuisance, a misunderstanding between neighbors. They told me to document everything and offered vague advice on staying safe. I left feeling more helpless than ever, knowing they wouldn't do anything until something serious happened. The following weeks felt like a blur of anxiety and dread. I barely left my apartment, afraid he might be lurking around every corner. I installed extra locks on my doors and set up a camera outside, but every creak of the floorboards or rustle of leaves made my heart race. I was constantly on edge. I stopped going to places I loved, avoiding friends because I didn't want to put them in danger. I felt like a prisoner in my own life. Then, one night, I woke up to a noise outside my window. My heart was pounding as I slowly crept to the curtain, peeking through the gap. There he was, standing in the shadows, his face illuminated by the streetlight. He looked different, more intense, and I felt a surge of panic. I grabbed my phone and called police, but before I could even dial, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. I felt a mix of relief and fear wash over me. He was still out there, still watching. The next morning, I found a new note on my doorstep. This one was longer, filled with ramblings that made my stomach turn. It was a mix of admiration and obsession, a desperate plea for connection that felt suffocating. He wrote about how he understood me better than anyone else and how he wanted to protect me from the world. I felt violated, like he'd invaded my mind as much as he had invaded my life. I decided enough was enough. I couldn't live like this anymore. I packed a bag and drove to a friend's house, hoping to find some safety in numbers. I told them everything, and they were supportive, but in the back of my mind, I knew this wasn't over. I could still feel his presence lurking just outside my periphery, like a shadow that refused to leave. The weeks turned into months, and the stalking didn't stop. I moved again, changed my phone number, and even altered my appearance, cutting my hair and changing my style. But despite my efforts, he still found me. I started to lose hope, feeling like I was living in a horror movie with no ending in sight. There was no resolution, just the constant dread that he was out there, somewhere in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. I wish I could say there was a heroic conclusion to this story, but the truth is, it dragged on a never-ending loop of fear and paranoia. I learned to live with the anxiety, to look over my shoulder, and to trust my instincts. I realized that sometimes there's no closure, no final confrontation, just a lingering sense of dread that becomes part of your reality. And that's a heavy weight to carry, knowing someone is out there still watching. I didn't really think much about stalking until it happened to me. It all started innocently enough. I was a junior in college, juggling classes, part-time work, and some semblance of a social life. My days were filled with the usual chaos of assignments and late-night study sessions, but it was my nights that began to unravel into something darker. I just moved into a new apartment, a cozy little place on the outskirts of campus. I felt safe, or at least I used to. One evening, after a long day, I returned home and noticed a car parked outside my building. It was a beat-up sedan, nothing too unusual for the area, but the way it sat there for hours on end made my skin prickle. I shrugged it off, thinking it was probably just a neighbor. After all, it was a college town. People came and went at all hours. But the next day, the same car was still there, and this time I could have sworn I saw someone inside staring at the building. I felt a chill run down my spine, but pushed it aside and went about my day. As the days turned into weeks, that car became a permanent fixture in my peripheral vision. I'd see it parked outside when I left for class, sitting there like a silent watcher. Sometimes I'd spot the same figure inside, hunched over the steering wheel, but I could never make out any details. Part of me wanted to believe it was just my imagination running wild. College life can make anyone paranoid, right? But deep down, I knew something felt off. My friends began to notice my unease. They laughed it off, calling it a campus urban legend, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then things escalated. One night, while I was heading back from a late-night study session at the library, I spotted the car again, but this time it was parked much closer to my building. My heart raced as I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, but I couldn't ignore the way my instincts screamed at me to be cautious. The next day, I decided to change my routine. I took a different route to class, hoping to shake whatever was following me. But that didn't work. I started to notice more signs that I couldn't explain away. My social media accounts were visited by strange profiles, and I began receiving random friend requests from people I didn't know, all with minimal information. I began to feel like I was living in a horror movie. Friends who used to joke about my paranoia started to grow concerned. They offered to walk me home, to stay with me at night, but nothing could ease the dread that clung to me like a shadow. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, I decided to treat myself to some takeout. I was just about to dig in when I heard a faint noise from outside. It was subtle at first, more of a shuffling than anything else. I peered out through my window, and my heart dropped. The car was there again, but this time the figure was outside, pacing back and forth, a silhouette against the streetlight. I felt paralyzed, staring at this person who had invaded my sense of safety. It was surreal, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but all I could do was watch. Days turned into a blur of anxiety. I stopped going out at night unless absolutely necessary, and even then, I felt like I was being hunted. I tried to document everything, dates, times, descriptions, but it felt futile. My friends urged me to go to the police, but I hesitated. I didn't have concrete evidence, just a gut feeling that something was wrong. The idea of being dismissed as just a paranoid college girl was terrifying. What if I was overreacting? What if I was wrong? Then, one fateful night, everything spiraled out of control. I was lying in bed, trying to drown out the panic, when I heard a knock at my door. My heart raced as I glanced at the clock. It was after midnight. I stayed still, holding my breath. Another knock, louder this time. It felt like the walls were closing in. I grabbed my phone and texted a friend, asking him to come over, but I didn't dare move from my spot. The knocking continued, turning into a rhythmic pounding that made me feel like I was trapped in a horror flick. Suddenly, I heard a voice. It was muffled, but there was no mistaking the urgency. I felt sick with fear. Who was this person? How did they know where I lived? I pressed myself against the wall, praying they wouldn't break in. The pounding stopped, replaced by silence that felt heavier than before. Just when I thought it might be over, I heard a rustling outside my window. I dared to peek through the curtain, and what I saw has haunted me ever since. The figure from the car was standing just outside my window, staring into my room. I froze, and in that moment, something inside me snapped. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my voice trembling as I tried to explain the situation. The operator assured me help was on the way, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still alone. The figure outside seemed to sense my fear, as if feeding off it. I took a step back from the window, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the sight of that person, who now looked more like a ghost than a human. Seconds felt like hours, and just as I thought I might pass out from fear, I heard sirens in the distance. The figure took off, disappearing into the shadows, leaving me breathless and shaken. When the police arrived, I felt a mix of relief and embarrassment. I explained everything, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They searched the area, but found nothing. They took my information and advised me to stay vigilant, but I felt like they didn't truly understand the gravity of what had just happened. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on my couch, every creak of the building sending jolts of fear through me. I knew I couldn't stay in that apartment anymore. I began looking for a new place, even considering crashing with friends for a while, but the idea of leaving behind my life felt overwhelming. The stalking didn't just take my sense of safety, it took away my peace of mind. Weeks passed, and things quieted down, or at least I convinced myself they had. I moved into a new apartment, far away from that old place, and for a while I felt free. But even now, years later, I still look over my shoulder. I still feel that prickling sensation when I'm alone. It's a weight that never truly lifts. Stalking isn't just an act. It's a violation that lingers long after the threat is gone. And sometimes I wonder if that figure is still out there, lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. It seemed like something that happened to other people, the kind of stuff you hear about on true crime podcasts or see in movies. I always believed I had a good sense of my surroundings, that I was aware of the people around me. But the day I first noticed him was the day everything changed, and my ordinary life took a sharp turn into something sinister. It started on an unremarkable Wednesday afternoon when I decided to take a walk in the park near my apartment. The sun was out, and the trees were starting to show signs of early spring. I remember feeling a sense of calm wash over me as I strolled along the path, earbuds in, listening to my favorite playlist. I wasn't paying much attention to the world around me until I felt a chill race down my spine, an eerie sensation that I was being watched. I glanced around, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. There were joggers, dog walkers, and a few kids playing with a frisbee. But there he was, standing a little way off, leaning against a tree. I didn't think much of it at first, just another person enjoying the day. I continued my walk, but the feeling of being watched intensified. I could feel his gaze burning into me even as I tried to shake it off. I told myself I was being paranoid. After all, it was just a coincidence. The next time I saw him, it was 2 days later. I had gone to a small cafe to grab a coffee. As I sat by the window, scrolling through my phone, I felt the same unsettling sensation. I looked up, and there he was again, standing across the street, just staring at me. My heart raced. This time, I was sure of it, he was watching me. I quickly turned back to my phone, hoping he would just go away. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was studying my every move, waiting for the perfect moment to approach me. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head. Maybe he was just a guy with a crush, or maybe he was waiting for someone. But as the days passed, the encounters became more frequent. I would see him wherever I went. The grocery store, the library, even at the gym, always lurking in the background, never coming too close but always close enough for me to feel his presence. I began to keep track of his movements, noticing his familiar gray hoodie and the faded jeans he wore every time. It was as if he was mapping out my routine, and the realization sent a wave of dread through me. I started to change my habits, taking different routes to work, going to different places, but no matter where I went, he seemed to follow. It was like a twisted game, and I was the unwilling participant. I began to feel trapped in my own life, constantly looking over my shoulder, my heart racing with every shadow that moved. I wanted to confront him, to ask why he was following me, but fear held me back. What if he was dangerous? Things escalated quickly. I began receiving strange messages on social media from accounts I didn't recognize. They were vague but unnerving comments about my post that made me feel exposed. "You look happy today," one read, as if he was watching my every move online too. I felt like I was losing control. My friends noticed I was acting differently, more anxious and withdrawn. It was hard to explain to them what was happening without sounding paranoid or like I was overreacting. I decided to take action. I started documenting everything: dates, times, descriptions of encounters. I even took pictures of him from a distance, hoping there would be something I could show the police if it came to that. My anxiety peaked when I realized he had started showing up in places I never mentioned to anyone, like the small yoga studio I had recently joined. The instructor had noticed my unease and offered me support, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her the full story. One evening, I was heading home after a long day at work, and I noticed him again, leaning against a lamppost just a few blocks from my apartment. My heart dropped. I didn't want to go home. I felt exposed and vulnerable, and the weight of his gaze felt like a physical burden. I ducked into a nearby store, pretending to browse, hoping he would lose interest and leave. But when I peeked outside, he was still there, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, waiting. I made the decision to call the police. They were professional, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. I shared my documentation, the photos, the messages. They advised me to stay vigilant and to consider a restraining order, but they couldn't do much without more concrete evidence. It felt like a slap in the face. I was terrified, and they were treating it as if it were just a nuisance. That night, I locked every door and window, the usual comfort of my home replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. I barely slept, every creak of the floorboards making me jump. I kept the lights on and my phone close, staring at the screen like it was a lifeline. I knew I had to confront him, but how? I couldn't keep running forever. The next day, I decided to face him. I was tired of living in fear. I waited until I saw him again, close enough that I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I approached him, my palms sweating and my heart pounding. But as I got closer, I froze. He smiled, a twisted, unsettling grin that sent shivers down my spine. I turned on my heel and ran, my breath coming in short gasps. I didn't stop until I was safely inside my apartment. I could feel his presence outside, lurking in the shadows. I didn't know what to do anymore. I felt hopeless. The police had warned me to be careful, but I was already living in a nightmare. I decided to move. I found a new place across town, hoping it would be a fresh start. I packed up my life, my heart heavy with the weight of my fear. On the day I moved, I felt a strange sense of relief. I was ready to start over, to leave everything behind. But as I settled into my new apartment, I glanced out the window and saw him standing across the street, just as he always had. I was still trapped. Never in a million years would I think I'd be the kind of person to attract a stalker. I mean, I'm just an average guy with a 9-to-5 job, a modest apartment, and a couple of close friends. Sure, I have a social media presence, but who doesn't these days? I've always kept my information pretty private, so it came as a complete shock when the unsettling events began to unfold. I've debated sharing this story, but maybe it'll help someone else recognize the signs. Plus, I need to get it off my chest. It all started on an ordinary Tuesday. I had just wrapped up a long day at work and was scrolling through my phone while waiting for the bus. I noticed a notification from a new follower on Instagram. The name didn't ring any bells, and their profile was sparse, No real name, no photos, just a few vague posts about random quotes. It didn't seem alarming at first, just another faceless account in the sea of social media. I followed back, thinking it was someone from work or a friend of a friend. At first, nothing happened. Days turned into weeks, and I'd occasionally see likes on my photos or some vague comments. It was nothing out of the ordinary. People I didn't know often interacted with my posts. I should have paid more attention when I noticed the patterns. The likes were almost immediate, as if they were waiting for me to post something new. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just a quirky algorithm or someone with too much time on their hands. Things took a turn when I noticed my daily routine seemed to be mirrored by this account. I'd post a picture from my morning coffee run, and within minutes, they would comment on it. I'd share a sunset photo from my balcony, and there it was again, a comment, a like, sometimes even a strange emoji that felt just a bit off. I felt a shiver down my spine, but I didn't want to overreact. I thought maybe it was a coincidence, some weird social media quirk. But then came the DMs. At first, they were harmless, just compliments about my photography skills or questions about the places I'd been. I could sense a creeping unease, though, as the messages started to shift tone. They became more personal, referencing things I'd said in passing on my posts. Comments about my interests, my favorite movies, even my dog. It was as if they were piecing together a puzzle of my life from the fragments I shared online. I began to feel paranoid. I tried to keep my life under wraps, but it was almost impossible. I began checking my profile settings, making sure everything was private, but that didn't seem to change anything. They still found a way in. I could feel their presence looming as I went about my daily life. I canceled plans with friends, avoiding places I usually frequented. I wanted to escape the nagging feeling that someone was watching me. I decided to block the account, thinking that would solve the problem. I felt a sense of relief wash over me, but that didn't last long. A few days later, a new account popped up with an even more random name. I could almost hear the mocking laughter echoing in my mind. I blocked that one too, but it was a game of whack-a-mole. Each time I blocked them, they'd reappear with a different username. It felt relentless and exhausting. As weeks passed, I noticed strange things happening in my life that I couldn't quite explain. My dog, usually friendly and playful, began to bark at shadows. I found my front door slightly ajar one morning, even though I clearly remembered locking it the night before. Odd packages started showing up at my doorstep, items I had never ordered. I tried to convince myself it was just a series of unfortunate coincidences, but deep down, I knew something was off. I started to change my routine. I'd take different routes to work, vary my coffee shop visits, and even switched up my gym schedule. But every time I thought I was free, I'd see them again in the corner of my eye. Just a figure lingering too long outside, or a car that seemed to circle my street a little too often. I became a prisoner in my own life, living in constant fear of the unknown. I reached out to a few close friends, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. I dropped subtle hints, testing the waters to see if they'd noticed anything odd. They were supportive but brushed it off as me being overly cautious. I felt even more isolated. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted, and nobody seemed to understand. One evening, while I was taking the trash out, I saw someone standing at the end of my street. They were just standing there, looking toward my apartment, shrouded in shadow. My heart raced, and I quickly ducked back inside, locking the door behind me. Was that them? The thought sent chills down my spine. I grabbed my phone and called a friend, desperate for some reassurance. Things escalated when I found my car vandalized the next morning. Someone had scratched a message into the side of it, something twisted and unsettling that made my stomach churn. It was then that I realized this wasn't just some harmless online infatuation. I felt like I was in a horror movie where the protagonist is always one step behind their tormentor. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I gathered evidence, screenshots of messages, photos of the vandalism, and notes about the strange encounters. I went to the police, who listened patiently but seemed skeptical. They told me that without concrete evidence of a threat, there wasn't much they could do. I left feeling defeated, as if I was shouting into a void. I spent the next few weeks on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder. I took self-defense classes, installed security cameras, and even got a new phone number. I felt like I was being pushed to my limits, and just when I thought I was starting to regain control, the stalking took a darker turn. One day, while I was at work, I received a notification that made my blood run cold. It was a post from that same account, but this time it was a photo of me. I was caught off guard, sitting on a bench during my lunch break, completely unaware. The caption was sinister, hinting at how closely they had been watching. It was the final straw. I knew then that I had to get out of my apartment, away from the life I had built. I moved in with a friend for a while, hoping the change of scenery would help me breathe again. I contacted a lawyer, hoping to get a restraining order, but the process was exhausting and drawn out. I felt trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. Eventually, I got a message from the original account, the one that started it all. It was a simple note saying that they would always be watching and that I could never truly escape. It was a chilling reminder that no matter where I went, this person was still out there, lurking in the shadows. I've since moved on, but I can't shake the feeling that someone is always watching. I've since deleted all my social media accounts and made my life as private as possible. The experience changed me in ways I can't fully articulate. Sometimes I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for the perfect moment to slip back into my life. It's a haunting thought and one I carry with me every day. I found myself in the middle of a nightmare that felt more real than anything else in my life. It all started innocently enough, just another day in my routine. I was in my last year of college, juggling classes and part-time work while trying to maintain some semblance of a social life. I was in my usual groove, heading home late after a long study session at the library when I first noticed him. At first, I didn't think much of it. Just a guy hanging around a campus, nothing out of the ordinary. He was tall, with dark hair and a hoodie pulled up over his head, blending in with the shadows of the night. As I walked to my car, I felt an odd prickling sensation at the back of my neck. When I glanced back, he was standing there, watching me. I shook it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination. It wasn't until I drove home and parked that I noticed he was still lingering nearby, now sitting on a bench, staring in my direction. My heart raced as I fumbled to lock my car doors, but he didn't move. I hurried inside, telling myself I was being paranoid, that he was probably just waiting for someone. But the next day, and the day after that, he was there again. Same spot, same hoodie, same unyielding gaze. I began to feel that familiar prickling on my neck whenever I was on campus. It was as if that feeling was now my constant companion. I started altering my routine, taking different routes to class and leaving earlier or later, hoping it might throw him off. But he was always there, like a shadow that refused to fade. I confided in a couple of friends, but they brushed it off, saying I was overreacting. He's probably harmless, they said. I wanted to believe them, but the unease was growing in my gut. I had never been one to jump to conclusions, but this felt different. It gnawed at me, this sense that something was off. I tried to focus on my studies, but it was hard to concentrate with the feeling of being watched hanging over me every minute of the day. One evening, I decided to stay late at the library to study for an exam. I figured if I was going to be on edge, I might as well be productive. As I gathered my things to leave, I looked up and saw him standing by the entrance, as if he had been waiting for me. I felt my heart drop. The library was nearly empty, and the silence was suffocating. I took a deep breath and walked towards the exit, keeping my eyes locked on him. He didn't move, just stood there watching me. I hurried past him, my pulse racing. I glanced back as I stepped outside, half expecting him to follow me. But he just stood there, still as a statue. I quickly made my way to my car, my hands trembling as I fumbled with my keys. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing with a million thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. Things escalated after that night. I began receiving strange messages on social media, anonymous accounts that seemed to know details about my life that were not public. Little things like my favorite coffee shop or the classes I was taking. At first, I thought it was a prank, but the messages grew more unsettling. They started referencing my daily routine, my habits, where I went after class. I felt like I was trapped in a twisted movie, one where the villain knew my every move. I reported the messages to the campus security, but they didn't take it seriously. "Are you sure it's not just someone messing with you?" they asked. I felt a wave of frustration wash over me. It was like they couldn't see the danger lurking right in front of them. I tried to keep my head straight, but paranoia seeped into my daily life. I stopped going out alone, started walking with friends everywhere, and changed my routes again. One night, I was at home, binge-watching a series to distract myself, when I heard a noise outside. It was late, and my heart sank as I peered through the window. There he was, standing across the street, just watching my house. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. The feeling of being trapped was overwhelming. I ducked away from the window, trying to calm my racing heart. Days turned into weeks, and I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. I became a ghost in my own life, avoiding places I loved and staying indoors as much as possible. I stopped answering my phone, deleted social media accounts, and even changed my email. I felt like I was in a never-ending cycle of fear, and I didn't know how to break free. Then, one day, I decided I couldn't live like this anymore. I needed to confront my fear, to take back control of my life. I gathered all the courage I could muster and went for a walk around the campus during the day. I felt like I was walking into the lion's den, but I was determined to show him I wouldn't be intimidated. As I walked, I noticed him in the distance, leaning against a tree, watching me with that same cold intensity. I felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. I didn't want to be his prey anymore. I turned and marched straight towards him, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I got closer, he just stood there, a smirk creeping across his face. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I never thought I would feel so powerless. I turned and ran, not looking back. I didn't stop until I reached my car, slamming the door shut behind me. My mind raced, and I knew I couldn't let him control me any longer. I drove straight to the police station, my heart pounding in my ears. When I finally shared my story with an officer, I could see the skepticism in his eyes. But I didn't care. I laid it all out, the stalking, the messages, the fear that had taken over my life. I felt like I was finally taking a stand. They agreed to investigate, and for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. The hope quickly faded when I received a final message, a chilling reminder that he was still out there. It read, "You can't hide from me." I realized then that this wouldn't just end with a simple report. I had to be vigilant, always looking over my shoulder. The nightmare was far from over.